going through some updates based on the 2024 NACAC conference that I attended last month. And I think there are a lot of useful bits of information here that can definitely help you regardless of whether or not you're a rising, or not rising, but a current senior, or you're younger in high school or even in middle school, because these are the latest trends that a lot of the admissions people were talking about at that conference in Los Angeles, right? So it's going to be really helpful information. It's going to be pretty packed, so I will try to get through as much of it as I can, but rest assured, I will save some time at the end for your questions and answer them as best I can. So I do ask that you go ahead and put your questions for me in the Q&A box as usual. If you do have any questions, I'll get to them at the end as best I can. So please go ahead and put it. I'd suggest you actually start putting down the questions if you see something in my slides or if I'm a certain topic that you want to ask about. But if you just have more general questions about your situation, you can certainly leave that until the end. Okay, all right. So without further ado, let's get started. So first and foremost, let's re-examine the current landscape of selective college admissions. Another thing that was released last month are the latest US news rankings for the top national universities. There's not probably too much change here. This is very similar to ones I showed you maybe like 2 or 3 months ago for my last English seminar. When I had this list, there's some, colleges kind of leapfrogging each other. Now there's a massive logjam for number 6, if you can see here. There's about 4 colleges that are tied for number 6, being Caltech, Duke, Johns Hopkins, and Northwestern. But if you're really looking at the same schools that are here in the top 15 or 16 or so, it's really just the same schools, more or less. Now, if we expand that to take a look at the list of top liberal arts colleges, also probably not much change. I think Swarthmore bumped up a little bit, but Williams is still the number 1. Amherst has been number 2 for a while here. Swarthmore regained its number 3 status, and the Naval Academy in Annapolis bumped down to number 4. Other than that, like I said, it's probably the same names. I think the 2 other service academies were bumped down a little bit. I think they were tied for like 6th or 7th last year, but it's more or less very similar to last year. Okay. Now, a little bit of movement on the public universities front. UCLA, which was tied with Berkeley last year at 15th, is now the clear-cut highest-ranked public university in the country, whereas Berkeley fell a couple of notches. Not too much different, though, I would say, right? So generally speaking, if you're interested in fields like engineering or business, Berkeley would still probably be viewed as the more competitive school, but UCLA, because of its popularity and because of its location, I think there are other factors other than just pure academic strength that they factor into these rankings. As you can see, a lot of the same names are here. The UCs are very well represented. So if you live in California and you get to take advantage of the in-state tuition, that's a very good deal for you because you got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 of the UC campuses, right? So the top 6 out of the 9 are represented here in the, not only are they top 40 overall for US News, they're within the top 15 or so of public state universities. Okay, now, once again, a review of the landscape of Ivy League admissions. Pretty much, not too much has changed here. So many of these schools, some are going up or down, which is kind of, I guess, in a way, a good sign, right? Because there's not this concerted, every school is dropping in terms of acceptance rate like it was about 3 or 4 years ago at the peak of COVID. All right, so as you can see here, the last 3 years, Harvard's actually increased its acceptance rate, but Yale is the complete opposite. You see a drop here in terms of Yale's acceptance rate over the last 3 years or so. If you were to go beyond that to take a look at other private universities, you will notice here it's a trend that's been happening now for the last, I would say, decade or so. The top private universities in big in big cities, big metropolitan areas have become increasingly harder. So we see this with schools like NYU and USC, right, which are like the non-Ivy League, really solid private universities in their respective cities for New York and Los Angeles. We see this too with a lot of schools in Boston and Chicago, right? So obviously like pretty solid in terms of the acceptance rates there. They're all, well, most of them at least, are sub 10% now, right? So this is kind of the trend that we have right now. So luckily though, it's sort of plateauing or stabilizing a little bit. The drop hasn't been as steep as it has been the last few years. Okay, so with that, I do want to give you a quick update though, as it relates to California specifically. I know a lot of The people who watch this are in California, and a lot of the students and parents are there. So this is something you're probably familiar with, but it also might impact you if you are from out of state and you're applying to certain California private schools. One of the key things that basically happened just about a little over 2 weeks ago is that California passed a law. Governor Newsom, who's governor of California, passed legislation 2.5 weeks ago that bans legacy and donor preferences in admissions at private and nonprofit universities across California. So in terms of the most selective universities, this will mostly impact schools like Stanford and USC. One key thing, though, is that it doesn't really impact schools like the UCs or the Cal States because they never really had legacy policies to begin with, right, as public institutions, right? Another thing, too, is that this is reflective of a broader national trend. I would say there are a lot other states that are kind of going to follow suit with California here because there are national polls that have shown that about 75% of Americans are actually opposed to this practice of legacy admissions. And with affirmative action being struck down last June, or June of last year, I should say, this has been next on the chopping block, right? So colleges are saying, well, if you're not going to be discriminating by race, we shouldn't give any sort of preferences based on things like wealth or, you know, people's connections with the school either, right? So that's now the big rallying cry around these. So like I said, for California, at least, these will most likely impact private schools like USC and Stanford and, you know, to a lesser degree, maybe like the Claremont colleges. But I think over the years, I would say USC and Stanford are the biggest ones that did utilize legacy admissions. However, both schools have signaled an intention to follow along with the new California law, and they're willing to comply with this, right? So this doesn't really affect too many students, but given that in California there are a lot of USC alumni, it's probably going to be mostly impacting them and to some degree Stanford graduates as well. Okay, so without further ado, let's talk about updates from the NACAC conference, which I attended with a couple of other HS2 counselors in late September, right? So for those of you who don't know, NACAC stands for the National Association for College Admissions Counseling, which is the governing body of all the different admissions officers and all the high school guidance counselors across the country. So this is a huge conference with literally more than a couple of thousand people attending, right? So basically over there are a lot of different conferences and seminars where people talked about a lot of things that were going on, a lot of trends, a lot of the changes that people want to see in the admissions world. They discuss it. They have these conferences. They do various polls. It's good networking opportunities for you to kind of like pick people's brains and talk to them. They have booths where you can talk to them about the latest happenings with their colleges. And luckily, that was definitely an opportunity for us to find out more information about some key things that you would like to know about, which is why I like to do these seminars immediately after I attend these conferences, so I can at least distill some of the main takeaways that I was able to get. Now, this won't be everything. Over the next few months, I'll probably try to integrate some of the things that I've also learned from NACAC in my future seminars as well, just because, you know, in the format that we have for about 45 to 50 minutes, there's not enough time for me to share every single little tidbit that I learned. But I will try my best to make sure that anything useful or timely that you should know about, especially for the applications, you definitely have access to it. Okay. All right. So let's first talk about curricular changes. One of the key things, if you've been paying attention to the news, is that there's been a growing movement to sort of I guess, even out the playing field a little bit when it comes to math education, right? Some people are saying like, oh, it's not fair that certain students can access this AP or that AP. And basically in the crosshairs of this conversation has been AP calculus, right? Should we even strive to or try to push students to try to finish AP calculus in high school? Is it necessary? And so there have been about 21 states that have been moving towards this initiative to revamp math curricula in various states. They wanted to make math better reflect what they say student interests, right? Which means not a lot of people feel like they need calculus in their fields. And so therefore they want the math curriculum in high school to reflect that, right? They say like, well, maybe things like data science or statistics might be better served for other fields because not every student wants to go into the STEM field. Well, of course, it's a double-edged sword, right? Because if you're going to go into a STEM field that can utilize these things, of course, you want access to higher level and more rigorous math classes. But of course, not everybody is going to want or need that. So hence the dilemma, right? There's also move to even integrate certain of these concepts like statistics into other classes other than AP statistics, right? Because oftentimes AP statistics isn't accessible until like, let's say senior year for most students. So they want to integrate some of these things into even classes like Algebra 2, right? So there's been a little bit of controversy here because in some school districts, for instance, they're talk of sort of scaling everything back so that you're maybe starting with geometry or even as early as Algebra 1 instead of trying to accelerate. And in the past, in the last decade or two, there's sort of been a shift towards having students take Algebra 1 and geometry even as early as 7th and 8th grade, especially in certain very academically rigorous school districts, I guess, in California, right? So with this move, though, there's sort of this worry that, hey, if I'm an advanced math student, will I not be able to access these classes, right? So, it's definitely something that's a bit controversial. So one of the key things from NACAC, though, is that they did a survey of all the different, NACAC members that, there's about over 1,200 NACAC members who took the survey about the role of calculus in a high school curriculum, right? And many admissions officers, despite this movement, still placed a high value on completing calculus as a signal of higher qualifications, especially if you're going to go into a STEM field, right? And while they said, yes, sure, statistics can be useful, the polls nonetheless show that they still deemed AP statistics to be like less competitive or less rigorous and therefore less favorable to admissions, right? So there's already this cognitive bias towards saying if you take calculus, you're a stronger student for math or just a stronger student in general. So hence the dilemma, right? Because if this is the way colleges feel and there's a movement by these school districts to sort of de-emphasize calculus, it puts certain students at a disadvantage if their school district doesn't give them access to the types of classes that these college admissions people want, right? So one of the polls, for instance, asked, does calculus give applicants an edge in the admissions process? So 53% said yes, 47% said no, which would make it seem closer than it is. But the follow-up question is also pretty telling because they said the students who take high school calculus are more likely to succeed in college, and there's a whopping 79%. Right. So I think some people just feel obligated to say no because they don't want to make it feel like you have to have calculus. But nonetheless, if like close to 80% of them feel like you're going to be more successful in college, then there's definitely a bias towards accepting students with calculus. When polled to see which advanced high school math course carries the most weight in admissions, a whopping 75% said AP Calculus, compared to only 38% for AP Statistics, which I guess is fairly common conceptions. I think most people would just look at this pretty naturally. Anybody who's been to high school fairly recently would already know sort of like the pecking order of math classes. Most people just know, right? AP Calculus is deemed harder. AP Statistics is viewed as an easier math class, relatively speaking. Okay. All right. Another thing too is that another poll here asks, is statistics valuable? Well, yes. Okay, 96% did agree that statistics can be valuable, but when asked what weighs more, when stacked up against calculus, the polls suggest that calculus outweighs other advanced math, and that high school statistics is not as rigorous as high school calculus, right? So as you can see here, this is really, really important because if your child attends a school district where they're considering maybe pushing back the requirements or making it harder to finish calculus by the end of high school, this is definitely something you should probably advocate for, right? To have a more rigorous math curriculum, right? So there are ways for you to have both access to certain people and help strengthen the overall math curriculum without robbing, more ambitious students of the ability to take higher level math, in my opinion. Okay. All right, so what do we recommend here, right? So despite certain states and school districts de-emphasizing calculus and sometimes discouraging students from even taking it, we at HS2 encourage students to take the highest, most advanced level of math they can complete in high school, honestly, even regardless of their intended major, right? But especially if they're pursuing a STEM field, they should really try to push to take that as much as possible, right? Students can even accelerate by taking a math class either during the summers or maybe an online math class during the school year. So if their school districts, let's say, for example, are sort of scaling back the math level that you can access even as a freshman or an eighth grader, there are ways for you to sort of, still advance or accelerate, in terms of like your projected math pathway, I guess you could say. All right, so it's definitely something to bear watching, but I think it's definitely something that's also very important for students, especially because for a lot of our branches in California for HS2, a lot of the students there do want to go to fields like computer science and engineering, right? These are some of the more popular majors. So it goes without saying that a preparation for calculus is going to be really essential for them. Okay, next up, another big conversation topic at the NACAC conference was, okay, so it's been about a year and a half now since the Supreme Court decision on affirmative action. What happened? What are the results? Let's maybe take a quick look in terms of what the current conversation is like. So first of all, what was the immediate impact? Well, I know some people were kind of very enthusiastic about the prospect of banning affirmative action because the idea was all of a sudden that, hey, you know, if I'm an Asian student and they're not considering me Asian, then I certainly have a little bit better of a chance. But that hasn't really played out. And I think if you've watched any of my previous seminars, you've heard me caution against this, right? I've said that you want to be cautiously optimistic, right? And the reasoning for this is that it does take time, and I'll talk to you about that. Part of the other key things is that the Supreme Court did leave an option for students to write about their race in their college essays, and usually in the supplemental essays. So colleges do still have a means to be able to evaluate whether or not a student might be an underrepresented minority group based on what they write about in their essay. So even though it's indirect, they can't simply say, like, we're accepting a student because they are African American or Hispanic or Native American. Because they can still look at the essays, they still have a means by which to preserve certain levels of diversity in their incoming freshman classes. Other things, too, is that colleges have also shifted to non-race-based policies, right? So what are called sometimes race-neutral policies, right? So some of these conversations included talking about shifting more towards things like socioeconomic status or geography as a basis to determine like and assemble a more diverse class, right? So one of the key things, though, to be aware of is that, you know, based on the tone of the conversations, many admissions people aren't sort of like being secretive and saying, we'll still take a look at race and stuff, right? So based on the current tone, they're very, very paranoid about the legality of everything. They want to adhere to due process as best they can. And so one of the key things that they've been doing is that for the common application, on the college side of things, they have the option to basically not show the race category. They also will resort to things like not showing the name of the candidate temporarily, so that when they're reading the files, they're not going to be influenced to make decisions based on race, right? So this is definitely something that they've been really trying to factor in because, of course, with the Harvard lawsuit, these other colleges don't want to be sued in turn as well. So they've been very, very sort of conscientious about trying to keep up with that part. But at the same time, because of their prioritization of diversity, they still want to keep up diversity, okay? So just so that you're aware of what the current conversations are like about this at the conference. Okay, so there are also some data right now that with everything else, you know, there's been a little bit of an increase in terms of Hispanic enrollment. Now, this is not just for the top most selective colleges, by the way. These statistics are for like member colleges, which is a pretty broad swath, right? So this is not like the Ivy Leagues. This is not even like the top 50 or, you know, or so. This is across the board for many institutions. So as you can see here, there has already been a decline in terms of white student enrollment, and there has been a little bit of a boost. But if you look at this for Asian enrollment, it has more or less, it's risen a little bit from last year, but it has more or less stayed the same. There's been an increase in Hispanic enrollment, not that much for African American enrollment, and for other, it's about the same. Okay. Now, one key difference, though, is that even though they are seeing an increase in application volume for students of color, the net change actually isn't that big in terms of the actual enrollment of students getting there. Now, I've heard some theories at the conference saying that part of this could have been because of the little fiasco with the FAFSA last year. If you're not familiar, there was a massive delay, right? So people had to wait until December before they could file for the FAFSA. And people are speculating that that could have been a factor in terms of a lot of minority students deciding not to enroll because they were worried about the costs of a college education, which could have been a contributing factor, but I don't think that's the full story necessarily, right? Okay, so my key analysis here is it's definitely something that's going to take some time. Okay, in my opinion, if you were to look at the example of California back in the 90s, when California banned affirmative action for its public universities and institutions, it took several years. I think it took at least 5 years for there to be a meaningful increase in the percentage of Asian students, rising up in terms of the accepted students in these various UC campuses, for instance, right? So in this case, for the rest of the country, for these private institutions, it will probably take another 5, 6, or 7 years for there to be a meaningful increase as far as Asian students specifically, okay? Partially too, because colleges will still place a value on diversity and rely on other methods, like I said, race-neutral methods, to be able to still maintain a certain degree of diversity within their campuses, okay? So what's the takeaway here? If you're not an underrepresented minority, okay, because a lot of the families we work with are in fact Asian, right? So focus on other aspects that the colleges can still value. Yes, you may not be a URM, but you can still talk about how you have done very many activities that have shown your open-mindedness to and receptiveness to other cultural viewpoints and perspectives, and also that you've done things to promote inclusivity and diversity in your high schools through your various activities. I think that's really the best way to emphasize that you could be potentially a good fit for their college, even if you aren't necessarily, checking off a box for them that says that, oh, we're increasing the number of underrepresented minorities based on this alone. Okay. All right. Now, another